Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by John White. And today we're going to be discussing the Proto-Indo-European religion and the Proto-Indo-European gods. And before we get started on that, I just want to let everybody know that John White has a YouTube channel called Craig and Ford. It is tagged in the description below. And the link to it will also be in the pinned comment at the end of the stream. So if you're not already subscribed to that channel, you can click on that and subscribe to his channel now. And that being said, John, thank you very much for joining me today.
How do you do, Jacob? Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. So before we get started, before we get into the weeds, can you explain what the Proto-Indo-European religion is for those that are not familiar with that?
There's a big question. Let's start with what Proto-Indo-European is. So Proto-Indo-European is a language, and it's a hypothetical language. So no one we know of, or we've heard of, has spoken it. It's a language we've reconstructed based on languages across Europe and Persia or Iran and into India. And by seeing all the commonalities between those languages, we can trace them back and say, oh, they all came from a source language, Proto-Indo-European. And so by the same logic, we can say the stories told by those religions or those languages, religions are believed by the people who speak those languages, could theoretically be traced back to a religion. We can trace back, sort of perhaps ritual behavior and beliefs, cosmogonies, stories, and using that we can scholarly construct what we think the Proto-Indo-European religion was and what the pantheon looked like. But we also have to understand Proto-Indo-European, the language was spoken over probably 2,000 to 3,000 years before changing into separate languages. We would say were distinct from Proto-Indo-European. So when we say what is Proto-Indo-European, there's a number of places we can point to. One is at the very start where we see the people get together, which is on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. We then over a period of time, they turn into what we call the Yamnaya culture, and that culture is known for its use of new technology at the time, which was the wheel and pastoral farming and horseback riding, and that gave it a distinct advantage over cultures that didn't have horse riding and wheeled transport. And we see that culture spread across what we call the Indo-European landscape from Europe, so say through Iran and into northwest India. So that is the landscape we're talking about, and that is the basis of how we can have confidence that there was this culture in the very beginning that spoke this language, that had these stories that have evolved into the religions we see in ancient texts, such as the Rig Veda of India, to the Vestas of Iran, to myths in Rome and Greece, to the Eddas of the Scandinavians. So all that together is how we know there's something there. So, and their religion is, what we can determine they practice, looking at all the commonalities, and reduce them. What do they believe?
Yeah, it's one of these gods that I just want just to bring a quick example so people can grasp all of this. There's one god called Diu or Dayu.
Dayu. You're probably talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
The sky god, Sky Father.
Yeah, Godfather is how it's a literal translation, but Sky Father. So he was a god of everything above.
Yeah. And he's mentioned in the Rig Veda, and he is I believe as Indra's father at one point. It's interesting because this is a story where Indra overthrows Dayu, and you can see that it's kind of one could see that there's a link there, but in the Greek myth with Zeus overthrowing Kronos, there's a similarity, somewhat.
I would challenge that, but we can talk about that.
Yeah,
it's more.
One could argue is it could be a similarity. It's just throwing it out there because it's a storm god overthrowing a prior god, but Dayu is more. But the ironic thing is that Dayu is also linked to Zeus.
Yes, dear son.
So there's that too, and that could be seen as a problem with the link with Indra. Why don't you get in more into how you look at it real quick?
So that particular example is interesting. So Indra is what we could call a storm god. So the Indo-European pantheons tend to have a storm god, which is a god in charge of the weather, and that is a hangover from probably earlier influence from Neolithic farmers. Agricultural people needed rain, and we can talk about where all their gods came from if you want at some point. But the storm god rises up, and the storm god's really important because that's the god that gave warriors their strength. So we find there's a real link between warriors, rituals, and the storm god. And so in Greek Zeus, we actually see inscriptions in Greece of Zeus Percunus. Now, Percunus is the storm god of more of a Proto-European language.
And aren't there links? Sorry for interrupting. I was bringing this up real fast. Isn't that connected to Purin?
Pedon, yes.
Purin.
So Pedon is a cognate of Percunus. So again, a storm god. So there's many names like that cognates. So the storm god in Greece was Percunus, and we actually see inscriptions saying Zeus Percunus, suggesting that Zeus has combined with Percunus, and we actually find that Zeus's lightning bolt is cognate with Percunus. So in effect, Zeus consumes Percunus, and part of that is because Zeus is an unusual god in the Indo-European pantheon because he's a supreme god, much like Yahweh of the Abrahamic religions. He is a god that can do anything. He doesn't necessarily rely on any other gods to do things. He could do whatever he wants. Where we tend to find the Sky Father, the chief god, not being all powerful in the other pantheons. So there's real influence going on in Greece there, and that's because Greece is attached to the Mediterranean. There's lots of trade, lots of culture, lots of interaction with other people, and so we see really quite a significant amount of Near Eastern influence into that, such as the Greek creation myth, where you talked about Zeus defeating Kronos, is actually a creation myth of the Near East. The creation myth of Danu, I think Lambert writes about it in his Near East texts. We see that go through the Phoenicians, the Hittites, we also see them on, and that ends up in Greece. That is exactly the same myth, which is patricide, matricide, fair bit of incest. And this,
the Hittites have like a 4-stage situation where Alalu is overthrown by Anu, then Anu gets overthrown by Kumarbi, then Kumarbi is overthrown by Teshub. And in the Greeks, they have 3 stages. So Aranos is overthrown by Kronos, and then Kronos is overthrown by Zeus. But they don't have a 4th story. They kind of like skip that.
No, well, there are various stories. You just the different texts have different flavors, and so there is no one story in effect. For many of the Indo-European myths, there are different versions because these cultures last hundreds of years, and myths aren't really static. They will change their details depending on what's going on in society. And then that's what happens. So that was really an interesting link. And then if you talk about Deus Puter, the Sky Father, he becomes Jupiter. For the Romans, he becomes Tyr in the Nordic or Germanic religions. So he's absolutely, we feel really confident that there's that chief god and he's all around. So that's really what happened. And say next to him is his son, the storm god, who was very much associated with strength. And what we find is that the storm god fights dragons. That's a common theme. And so where you have, in fact, a really good one you may be familiar with is Marduk and Tiamat of the Mesopotamian creation myth.
Yes.
So Marduk and versus Tiamat is very, very similar to Indra versus Vitra, their storm god, in terms of, they both were given a net. They both have, I think it is a chariot. They both could be considered gods of agriculture because they're in charge of rain and the like. And you can go through these myths. There's actually a great thesis of, I think it's called Indra versus Vitra, which goes through about 20 similarities between these myths. And that wouldn't surprise anyone considering the closeness of northwest India and the Near East. And so, these are pretty much one myth taken from the other. And the reason we have these myths, this defeat a dragon for it to rain, is for agriculture. So what we find is that before humans had agriculture, we had myths of dragons, and those dragons actually gave water to the world to create life. Many early creation myths have a dragon, such as the rainbow serpent of Australia or the rain snake of South Africa. The world is dry, the snake comes along, carves a landscape and makes it rain, and life appears. But when we start having agriculture and we need it to rain, and it doesn't rain, then who do we blame? We have to blame the dragon that was giving us water, because it isn't giving us water. So the storm god is fighting the dragon in the sky. That's how they made sense of it. With all that noise going on up in the clouds, that must be the storm god killing the dragon so it rains, or at least defeating it so it releases water. That's a really interesting sort of evolution there. And then when it goes to the Indo-Europeans, they did not have agriculture. Well, they did, but it wasn't significant. It was pastoral farming, the farming of cows, which really brought them to the fore. And their dragon myth then changed into their dragon stole cows. And we see both versions of the warrior fighting the dragon for water and for the cows in the Rig Veda, for example. You can see the evolution of the religion as agricultural farming gets replaced with pastoral farming, and the cow eventually becomes sacred then in India, in the Hindu religion.
Chris Mack, thank you for your super chat. Thumbs up on the stuff. Will you cover Manu and Yemo creation story?
I can do, if you want. And that's a very good place to start a creation myth. So it's the perfect place to start. So one of the things we do is try to construct, or some people say reconstruct, but it really is constructing, because we don't have earlier versions of the myths pre this, but we can construct a creation myth of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. And the myth, I'll give you a synopsis of it. It goes that in the beginning, there was nothing apart from two primordial beings. There was Manu, meaning man, and Yemo, his twin. Okay, and Manu and Yemo floated through the empty cosmos for eons until they realized they needed a home to settle, to stop, to some place to perhaps create something. And Yemo says to Manu that he would sacrifice himself to create this place. And so Manu then sacrifices Yemo, and from Yemo's body he makes the world. And from his body parts he makes people. And this is really quite interesting. So from his head he makes priests and kings. From his body, his torso, he makes warriors, and from his legs he makes providers or farmers. And then we find with this creation myth, there's also a primordial bovine can appear in it, like a cow. And from the cow, we can often find plants and animals be created, and we see stuff along those lines in the Rig Veda, for example. So Manu has sacrificed his brother to create the world and create people. And then the result of that is that Yemo becomes lord of the other world, or lord of the underworld. is the Lord of Death. So that's sort of one of the first deities that pop up in the Indo-European pantheon. And Manu comes down to the world to teach people how to keep the world in order. And that's a really critical thing about Indo-European cosmogony. It's about order and chaos. And so what we find is that Manu decides he has to create a king, because the world hasn't got a king because his brother's dead, and Manu's come down as a priest, and his brother should have been king. So he makes a king from a part of the head of Yimo, part of the torso of Yimo, and part of the legs of Yimo. So the king is made up of all the parts that all the other people in the world are made of, and that is why kings are considered kings, because they can understand all the other people that are their subjects. That they understand a warrior, and they understand a priest, and they understand the provider. But it also means that if a king is made from the body parts of the entire of Yimo, and Yimo is also used to make the world, then the king is also tied to the world, such that if the king loses a body part or becomes ill, they often perceive the world as becoming ill. Or if the world becomes ill, so that it could mean drought, it could mean there's a famine or something going on in the world, that would be reflected on the king. So we see this relationship. Now, that's the crux of the creation myth. But there's actually a really interesting part of the creation myth in the creation of the world, and that is that when the Yimo's body is sacrificed, it is cut up into bits to make the world. And we see this sort of homologies, like they're often called, where the bones are make the rocks, the blood makes the water, the flesh makes the soil, the hair makes the grass, the eyes make the sun and the moon. And we see this aspect of body parts making different parts of the world. But then this is a cyclical thing because of order, that when a person is born, they actually take parts of the world to make that person. So when a baby is born, a little bit of the sun disappears and the moon disappears and the soil disappears and water disappears to make the baby. And so if too many people are born, or there's too much consumption of things, then the world will get out of step, out of balance. And so that's where we start seeing sacrifice come in. So things are sacrificed to retain balance, to put those body parts back into the world. So there were sacrificed cattle, and say his head would be assumed to go to, or his bones would assumed to go to rocks, his blood would assumed to go to water, and the like. So you see this really interesting concept of order and balance that they had, and I quite looking at that, and it works really well to me. I mean, I'm not a religious chap, but I think they've got a really good model for cosmogony there. So that's the gist of it. And then we know of other stories where they have to go off and get some cattle from the dragon that stole them. And there's also other aspects of this religion where if you're ill, for example, we actually find that there's a cure for baldness by using grasses, for example. So different plants will have different effects, but because the hair of Yimo became plants, they thought that actually if you're going bald, even 7,000 years ago, they could make a potion with plants to get your hair back by in effect reversing that cycle of building. But you see other things like that, such as rocks were used to help, put on arms, help recover broken bones, like broken arms or broken legs, and there's things like that. And then what they also thought, because you couldn't drink seawater, is that when you were ill and you had a sort of disease, that would seep out into the water, and all the water would run into the sea, and that's why the sea was salty, because it contained all the poison and the illness and the bad, whatever they would think it was, the bad stuff, let's call it, go into the rivers and float to the sea, and that's why the sea was salty and rivers were clean, because that's where all the illness went. And it's a really fascinating idea, also an ecology of the world. An ecology, of a view of the world like that.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, is the story that you're talking about linked with the Hindu story of Manu?
So the main hymn in the Rig Veda is the Purusa hymn. So that has they talk about Yama and Purusa being the equivalent of man, although there is Manu in the Rig Veda, and there's a flood story with him and the like. But we see these characters such as Ymir turn up. Ymo turn up as Ymir in the Scandinavian.
I was just about to ask about that.
Yeah. So we see in the Prose Edda, which is the sort of a book about poetry, but it talks about mythology in there for the Scandinavians. It talks about the world was created from Ymir by Odin really Inve killing him and making the world out from his body parts. But we also see him in Geomart. So in Iran, Geomart can be shown to be cognate or have an etymology back into Emo. So Emo goes to Gemol, which is like Gemini in Greek, the twins, because Emo is the twin. And we also see in Twisco, or sometimes Twisto, in Tacitus is Germania, he talks about this god, I think is, and again, that is cognate to twin, to Twisto, with Ymir. So we see plenty of I guess we'd call them footprints of these primordial beings in the stories around Indo-European space.
In that story of Ymir being torn apart in the Norse myth, that also kind of reminds me of Marduk and Tiamat, because when Marduk tears Tiamat apart, use different body parts to make everything. It's kind of similar.
Yes. I would say the aspect of killing someone to make the world, sacrificing something to make the world, is a very common myth theme in creation myths. It's not the only one. They're doing the earliest. The earliest creation myths we have are from humans just come from the underground out of a tree. That's the very earliest myth we can trace back. Sort of probably pre-out of Africa, so over 55,000 years, definitely. But the other big one, which you'll be familiar with, or a twist on it, is the Earth Diver myth. And the Earth Diver myth, the creation myth there, so this is way before the Indo-Europeans. This was being told before humans had travelled across and found the Americas in the last glacial maximum ice age. We see a story where the world is a primordial ocean, and on it is a water bird, a duck, want a better word, and the duck dives down into the sea, and at the bottom of the sea gets some mud in its beak and brings it to the surface, and that turns into land. Okay, and then that land, a tree grows, and people come out of the tree, and the tree pushes the sky up, and so life begins. However, what we find is that probably around 30,000 years or so, that story changes from a bird that dives down into water to a bird that flies off and grabs the land and bring it back. And it becomes part of a flood myth rather than a primordial sea. And the most famous example of that is Noah, where he has a dove which he lets go, that flies off to grab a branch, to come back to say land is available after the flood. That we're absolutely confident in is having an absolute relationship with the earliest creation myths of earth divers.
So now I want to take a look more closely at, because this is something that I thought to myself as a little paradoxical, is the link. I want to go back to Daiu and Zeus.
Okay.
Because when you look at Indra's character, it's interesting because there's a variant myth because I know there's like different versions of the story or whatever going on in the Hindu myth, and just like in other cultures. But in one of these myths, Indra plays the role of the guy that starts a flood because he's mad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Krishna, who in certain cases is linked to Vishnu as one of his many avatars. Krishna lifts a mountain over some people so that way they can survive the flood. Now, Vishnu is also said to warn man about the flood in his form Matsya, fish.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is supposed to be yet another avatar of the same god. In the Greek myth, you see Zeus starts the flood, and then Prometheus is the one that warns man. Although, I believe, I think it was Diodorus of Sicily who says that here was someone else said that Kronos plays the role of the one that warns man about the flood instead. Someone says something like that. It's not as well known, but there's a different variant myth where Kronos plays that role for some reason. But typically Prometheus is the one that plays that role.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So what do you make of that? Like, the linguistic evidence suggests Dayu is the one to be preferably linked to Zeus, but yet Indra has some strong mythological parallels with some aspects of Zeus's stories. That's why
exactly.
I'm curious about what you think.
Yes. So, and it also is very similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh. You know, a similar flood in there, and someone, as everyone knows. So it's it's a common myth. And as I said, Indra and Perkunos and Perun, these storm gods, Thor, it would have been in. And you see, actually, it's Thor's a really good example there, because Thor doesn't look like a storm god in Scandinavian myths. He looks like a powerful warrior god, and that's because he's transformed. They didn't worry about storms quite as much. But in Greek, as I say, Zeus consumed Perkunos into his role. So if there are myths about storm gods across the Indo-European landscape, then their stories when they came to Greece may well have been attributed to Zeus, which is why you may see some parallels there. I'm not saying it is, but we also have to bear in mind that we are talking thousands of miles and thousands of years between when these myths split up and what happened. So we often find sometimes myths get reflexed, so they're literally turned on their head. So for example, people hiding under a mountain, usually we find in older myths that the dragon that causes the floods is trapped under the mountain, and becomes a source of a river. That's a famous Chinese myth, that their four key rivers are dragons that cause flooding and were trapped under it. So we see, it's sometimes difficult to draw direct relationships, but there's obviously too much going on for it just to be coincidence. There's probably seeds of motifs there and myths there that have passed across, but we mustn't forget that Zeus is supreme, and he is supreme because he's consumed Perkunos, and so he has all the power that the storm god would have within him, although some of that's sort of lost. And we see that, I said, there is really lots of outside influence in Greece, which means it's a slightly different landscape to look at in terms of mythology and motifs. For example, Aphrodite, who went to Venus in the Roman myths, she isn't a natural Greek god. She has come from the Near East. She's travelled through Phoenicia and the Hittites to eventually turn up there. And we know that because if you look at early artwork, she's like a second-rate god, and she's not on the original list of the Olympians. I think we found I think it was in the Minoans, had a list of Olympian gods, like there's 11 of them, and she's not in there. She's external. So we find there's a lot of Neolithic influence into that Indo-European pantheon, and that's not unusual. We see that even in in Scandinavia, which many people think is truly Indo-European. It isn't. It has absolute agricultural myths in there. The myth of Balder. I don't know if you're familiar with Balder, who's considered like the
Balder, a Norse god?
Yes. It's
I
just
know. I know.
Sort of blonde hair, and he sort of emitted a glow like he was almost. He's often compared to Jesus, or even though he
died and rose again too.
Yeah, well, absolutely. That's agricultural. That's what I mean. He's not only that. So most people are familiar with the story for the poems, the Poetic Edda, but there's actually a book called by Saxo Grammaticus that has sort of older Danish myths, and in there's a slightly different story of Balder, and it talks about people having to cry to bring him back from the dead, and people crying is actually like a ritual for it to rain when it's a dry season in agricultural.
Is it sort of like the mourning for Adonis? Sort of.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's exactly that kind of thing. That kind of thing. So you have these, and Freya had cats, for example, and cats weren't really certainly weren't natural to Scandinavia. They've come from the Near East. There is significant Near East influence in even the most extreme places on the Indo-European landscape. I mean, so we have to bear that there is no sort of pure Indo-European culture. Everything's slightly mixed and diluted, and it's trying to understand how much and where and what. It's part of the work I do, really. To put it apart and see what is the original story. Because there's some fascinating ones. I mean, the story of Romulus and Remus that started Rome. That is a copy of the Indo-European creation myth with Manu and Nemo. If you think about it, they're twins. They suckle. So normally we see the twins suckle from the cow in the Indo-European myth. And they go up. Well, these suckle from a wolf, so there's a slight, but there's still a quadruped involved, a female quadruped. You find that Romulus kills Remus, and so there's that's a blood sacrifice there. And actually, if some of the older myths have then Romulus turning into a god at the end, he sort of disappears and rises into heaven, and so he's therefore considered sort of godlike. And if you actually take some of the older names, his older name was Quirinus, which could have cognates with Quirinus, which you can then relate to the twin figure. So most people think Romulus is more like Manu, but actually Romulus and Remus used to be called Remus and Romulus. Remus was the important character. Romulus was named after Rome. Rome wasn't named after Romulus. So Rome had already existed when Romulus was named. So we actually see his name transfer from Nemo. So it's really interesting when you get into these and how they've influenced and say changed with the landscape and what's going on in society.
So when did they create that story about Romulus and Remus? When was that myth created then?
I think our earliest versions of that could probably be dated to around 300 or 400 BCE or BC. On that. So certainly, so Rome was created around 700. I think it was 770 BC. So I think it's a few hundred years that we start seeing the story. But there are like many myths, many versions of the story, and I think Livy's, which was written in I think it was the 1st century AD, is probably the most popular, the one most people know. But originally, for example, Romulus, after he created Rome, he was quartered by the Senate. He was killed and sacrificed into many pieces. But you don't have that anymore because that doesn't seem like a fitting end to a god. So the story changes.
Yeah, that's interesting because if it's cut up into many pieces, that's what you said, right?
Yeah.
That's like Osiris in put back together by a goddess, and you also see that with which one was it? Dionysus.
Mm-hmm.
Because he gets torn apart by Titans, and then he gets put back together by Rhea, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
It's another similarity there.
Exactly.
And just to go back to the Hittites, because the reason why earlier I was kind of concentrating on Hindu parallels to the Greek myths and how there's some paradoxes there with Dayu and Indra in comparison to Zeus, is when you look at the Hittite myths, when you see how the Greeks are copying and retrofitting the myths, it's not a perfect copy. It's not like a one-on-one thing. There's some flux, role changing going on. And to give an example, that one of the examples I like is Kumarbi, when he overthrows Anu, he bites off Anu's manhood. But Teshub, who overthrows Kumarbi, emerges out of Kumarbi's skull because Kumarbi got pregnant after he bit off Anu's manhood, and Teshub leaps out of Kumarbi's skull, which we see this in Greek myth, but Athena is the one that plays the role of the one that leaps out of the skull. I guess I could throw a little joke in there, kind of alien style, one of the alien movies. But anyway, you've got Athena leaping out of Zeus' skull, but in the Greek myth, you see Kronos is the one that does the taking off the manhood role of Aranos, whereas you don't see a single god doing both. It's kind of split into two different, like one does one thing and the other does the other thing, kind of thing. So you see these situations where roles get changed. An analogy I like to use is like an actor being switched out for the same character. Or maybe in an earlier draft of a movie, they decide to take elements of a character and they give those elements to a different character. And so you can't roll it up and say it's exactly the same. It's a little more complicated, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. So one of the things I actually do in my real work is to understand why myths persist, why stories persist, because many people think, how can a story last 200 years without changing, let alone 2,000 or even 20,000, or sometimes, as I say, over 50,000? And there are many reasons for it. And the fact is that you have to measure what's actually changing. So stories, we say, have myth themes in them, which are small component parts that are resilient from linguistical and cultural barriers. So they will always be the same construct wherever you are, such as, let's say, twins suckling from a quadruped. That could be considered a myth theme, and you see that in most of the Indo-European creation myths, no matter where you are, whether it's a cow or a wolf or what the twins are, Romulus and Remus or whatever, that happens. So we get a story and we chop it up into myth themes, and those myth themes remain the same. But what changes in a story are the details. So it's because there's no point telling a story about penguins in the Sahara Desert. No one will listen to it, and it won't be told to anyone because no one knows what you're talking about. But if you had a story about a great warrior penguin from the Antarctica and you travel up to the Sahara, someone may change the penguin into a lion or a camel or something. The great warrior camel of the Sahara. If you haven't heard of it, it's a great story. And but that's what happens. These myths have the details that change, so they become relevant. But the actual structure of the story doesn't matter, and we see that all the time. That there are many myths the same. As I say, the creation myth of Greece is the same as the Hittite. We see it in the Persian Book of Kings. We see it in the creation myth of Danu. You could argue that some of it even goes back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. We see it in the Phoenicians. Exactly the same sort of plot, just the details have changed, and that's why we have confidence that myths survive, because they do. They just ignore the details and just look at the key plot points, and you'll see it happens again and again. Although sometimes plot points get reflexed, we would say, like it turned upside down, just to make the story sound a little different. And we can give many examples of that. But that's why these stories persist, and that's why they seem very similar with these little twists, because they've got to be adjusted to make it relevant. And the other thing that is perhaps important is that whilst the people who believe these myths, and so when I say myths, what I mean are like religious stories, because myths have sacredness in them, they have gods and sacred truths. We just don't believe in those religions anymore, so they're myths. But to anyone who's an atheist, they would look at the Bible as a myth sort of thing, or many of the stories as mythical. So we see these myths, but these myths aren't, but by the people who believe them, they believe they are divine projections. They are what the gods have said, and this is why they behave in a particular way. But actually, all myths are cultural reflections. They are whatever the culture believes, written down in a story form, and then people can say, "Oh yeah, we have to act this way because it says so in this religious book, and our God said so." But actually, at the end of the day, it was written by people who had the same thoughts and beliefs of you, and so that's why sort of some of the details change again for relevancy, to make people believe those things. And if we see very specific detailed changes, it's often due to ensure there is cultural alignment with belief of that culture. Does that make
Tuxedo
sense?
Mask, thank you for your super chat. Tuxedo says, we have God alien DNA. We are basically Numenorians. Where are you getting at? I mean, not sure. I mean, you're making claims there that have nothing to do with this discussion. I'm not sure where that's going. Anyway.
Okay, can I just add to what I said? Because it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts, Jacob, on this. That I think, from what I've just said about cultural reflection versus divine projection in myths, okay, that let's say people who believe the religion believes that their gods made the myths. I think that is one of the reasons why the Abrahamic religions actually persisted. Not the only reason, but one of them is that the Greek myths, the Roman myths, the Nordic myths, and even to some degree the Rig Veda, they are stories written by people about the gods. But when we look at the Abrahamic texts from Moses spoke to God, these are the words of Jesus, Angel Gabriel came down to speak to Muhammad. These are words from God. God said these words and then they're written down. So when it comes to is the myth cultural projection, or is it a divine cultural reflection or divine projection? The divine projection holds stronger in those myths where they say, actually, this is the word of our gods, rather than this someone wrote down a story of gods. Does that make sense? Is it?
Yeah.
And I think that could be one reason why the Abrahamic texts maybe persisted, because they were seen as more divine, more sacred.
Yeah, you kind of, well, it's not a perfect equivalence. There are obvious differences, but in the Egyptian myth, you've got gods who are just by speaking, they create, and I think Thoth or Toph might have played a similar role too in variant myths, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, there's a few riffs. I think it's slightly different, but Ptah definitely does.
I do know that. Ptah certainly does.
Yes, exactly. But he doesn't actually write the story. He doesn't write the text.
And what you've got going on in Judaism is that supposedly God writes the Torah through Moses, in a sense, and Moses takes the tablets down from the mountain and brings them to the Jewish people. I've seen some compare, and it's interesting because Moses was a lawgiver. I've seen some compare it to Minos in the Greek myth for being a son. He's viewed as a son of Zeus, and they see okay, Minos is a lawgiver because there's a myth where he's portrayed as having something to do with the origin of law, and at least some claim that. I'm not saying that's correct or not, but in the Hindu myth, you've got Manu, and I'm kind of skeptical. I can kind of see why some make that connection, but I think some caution is needed.
Yeah, I would say so. I think Manu, has more, far older and more symbology around him in terms of.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I would say Manu is a little more like Noah.
Well, certainly in some respects, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think that's a safer comparison.
Yes, I mean, and there's already a shifting of what's going on with it, because Manu isn't the primordial being anymore. When you look at the Rig Veda, he's been shifted out. We often see Purusa take more that role along with the Yama, and it's all slightly different. So, yes, I agree. Yeah, but I say it's hard to do direct comparisons without taking lots of context in place.
And it's especially become more interesting with recent scholarship there, because it appears that scholars are, at least some of them, are moving the dating of the Torah or Pentateuch a little later in time lately. And you see this with scholars like Gad Bernia and others who are questioning, can we really know if the Torah was written completely by like 500 BCE? It could be later. And there are other scholars like Russell Gomerican and another one I want to bring up is Jonathan Adler. Now, Jonathan doesn't specifically, he's not giving a concrete position on when the Torah was written. He's just simply saying it doesn't start becoming certainly concretized, if I could put it that way, until like the 2nd century BC or thereabouts.
Yes, I think most people agree. Yeah.
So if this is true, that the Torah is written a little bit later than generally believed, then it could allow for other influences that weren't really thought of before. Because the earlier it's dated, it's the more limited one is in terms of the comparing. Because if the Torah is written a little later, it could allow potentially for Hellenistic influence.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes,
because that's what I mean. Like, okay, so when the Ptolemaic period's going on, it could allow for that. But if the Torah is dated a couple hundred years earlier, that would be rather difficult.
Yes.
So that's why the dating kind of matters there.
And can I say something? So,
sure.
So one of the things I do is trace myths back, when we try and find the origin of myths, and I'll put that in quotes because we can never find the origin of a story. All we can do is go as far back as to where we think that version of the story started,
and then speculate. Yeah.
And we had sort of cut off that. But what could happen, and Levi Strauss writes about this, who's a famous mythologist, he says that sometimes, where we talk about the details changing of a story, sometimes the details have to change so much because there's other influences going on that the story changes so much you don't recognize it as being a relation to another story going on. And so you could have two stories next to each other that are related, but we wouldn't ever realize that. So when we trace a story back, what I'm saying is that we can only go back to that version of the story. There could be actually other stories around that are older, but we don't know are related, or that change so much, or the story we are sourced has changed so much from the original, we won't recognize the original. So even if we say the Bible became concrete at 200 BCE, and I think much of it did, although some of the stories are obviously far older. We can't always necessarily know if actually they were the original stories anyway.
Yeah, that it's complicated, and then I mean, it's a mess because there's a lot of hypothetical sources that are imagined behind the Pentateuch and the whole documentary hypothesis. It's that I'm not going to spend too much time describing, but I get why they think it, and it's interesting because it's based, the argumentation there, kind of skipping to the end there, is based on examining the Torah and recognizing a single author of the whole thing is difficult to believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I agree, but I like to be, I suppose, a little more careful and say, since we don't exactly know the circumstances of how that all coalesced, I think we should be open to the possibility it didn't quite happen the way it was imagined. Like, we have a bunch of hypothetical documents over, I'm going to date one of them on this century, another one on that century, because I asked the question, okay, how do you know that? How do you know it happened that way? One cannot know it happened that way. That's the problem.
Yeah,
while recognizing at the same time, the crux of the point is that there was still no single absolute author of the Torah. In fact, I do agree with that. But it doesn't necessitate that we know exactly what happened prior to it being written down that led to it being that led to it being collected together. So that's the difficulty there. Another way one could put it is that you had there's a different way that one could put it is, if I'll shut up about it, is one could look at the Torah as having a single author in a sense, but that the text, but he was using a lot of Hebrew sources that were lost. It's kind of saying the same thing, but in a different way. Because in the end, they kind of are saying that because they're saying it was put together by a redactor that was assembling multiple texts together.
Yes. Yeah, I mean,
but then again, and I know this could be viewed as being anachronistic, but if this happened today, that would technically be plagiarism, because what you're doing is you're plagiarizing a bunch of different people's stories. You're assembling it into one text. If that's what's going on, and then making changes to it that you want to make.
That happens all the time.
I mean, calling it your own. So that's kind of what would have happened in that situation.
Yeah. Well, it happened all over the place. I mean, look at Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Exactly the same thing. There isn't a single text written by a person. That's a group of texts pulled together and then made into one story. Those things were happening, and there was a lot of, you could argue, Greek influence in the Near East on how to write things. So, I agree. And we see certainly Ugaritic influence, significant Ugaritic influence into the Old Testament. We see many other stories. You talked about Ptah and the saying things into existence, and you see that in Genesis. I mean, I'm very much of the opinion that the first two verses of Genesis are the Enuma Elish synopsisized. In terms of the wind of God going over the deep, over Tiamat is in effect telling people, "Oh, this is Marduk has defeated Tiamat, and now we can get on with the story." As we see that, and one of the other stories we have just to show there's Indo-European stories in there. David and the Philistines has a cattle raiding myth, which is definitely an Indo-European myth. And then we see the snake in the Garden of Eden. That is actually African mythology about the loss of immortality that has just been repurposed from far older stories. So we know absolutely there are influences coming in from all directions, but how long they were there in the Near East before they were put into the Old Testament, that's what we don't know. Were they floating around for 1,000 years beforehand before turning into these stories, or were they adjusted at the time? They were written maybe 500 BC. Who knows?
One of the things that a later dating of the Torah would explain to me is the Isaac story. And I remember a while back, when I was first going through these various texts, learning about the Proto-Indo-European religion, learning about it, learning about the language hypothesis, other Proto-Indo-European stuff. I was learning all of this, and I was asking myself, where could they have gotten the story of Isaac from? Just one of my many questions is there's no really good parallels that I could find in Mesopotamian myth, but there is one that was so obvious that it was pointed out before by many in the Greek myth, the story of Phrixus. And his father, Athamas, was about to sacrifice him, but he gets stopped when I think it was a goddess, or even several, that intervened and prevented Phrixus' death. Something like that happened.
Mm.
And it reminded me, is it possible that they heard about that story and they were inspired by it to create the story of Isaac? And could Abraham be playing the role of Athamas in this situation where he's the one that's about to sacrifice Isaac, but he gets stopped by God, or Yahweh in that case?
That's interesting. So I don't know if you know what I do. So one of the other things I do, apart from studying the European mythology, is say understand the origins of myth, and I curate what is called the Mythology and Folklore Database. The Mythology Database. So that's a freely available resource for people, and that allows you to discover motifs of myths. There are over 200,000 narratives in there, and it shows you their dispersal across the world. So if you have a motif of a father killing a son, or sacrificing a son, or attempting to, you will actually be able to see its distribution and source data from where we get those stories from. And you could then build up a level of confidence, because everything's complicated and probabilistic in our world of trying to understand mythology. Build up a probabilistic picture of where that story may have originated from. So you could understand if it is a Indo-European story, or if it is a story from the Near East or from Asia, and it's come in from the East or whatever. So the mythology database is a exceptional resource, Jacob. If you're interested in those sorts of things, or any of your viewers, say it's free to use. Just have to register an email address so you can log on, but that's it. Just use it when it's used by universities across the world, from Harvard to Oxford, from Tokyo to Melbourne, Australia. And literally every week I'm working with academics and universities to get data and help research mythology. So a great resource if you're interested in that and searching those kind of things.
Yeah, for anyone else that wants to register and use it, I'll put the link in the description below and also in the pinned comment. I did not know that. So I appreciate that you brought that up.
It's fascinating. I say it'll show you a map of where stories are told, and just seeing that can blow your mind sometimes.
Yeah.
And then you've got to ask why. How the Earth Diver, as I said, the Earth Diver myth, or the Bird Scout myth, as we call it, with Noah. You see that in the Americas, and you see that across Eurasia, and you think, well, how did it get to the Americas? And the only way, because it didn't travel
for the Bering Strait.
It would have been via the Bering Strait, and that would have only happened 15,000 years ago. At the latest, maybe even earlier than that. And
because it would.
Myths.
Yeah, because there are some interesting, and this is something I also noticed myself, is there is some interesting parallels in some ways between Native American myths, South American myths, with even with the Near East. It's curious, and it might suggest like a super older religion, a common tradition that was that kind of like
There's
borrowing from.
the ferryman of the dead. That is
Yeah.
told in Americas and in Eurasia, suggesting that's over 15,000 years old. Yeah, there are beliefs we've had for a long time that you've had to, when you die, you have to travel somewhere and cross a river to get to the other world.
Yeah, the Incas, they think that Viracocha started multiple floods. He cleansed the earth multiple times and destroyed giants, which sounds very familiar. Um, and there's also this story. I forget which Native American tribe believed this, but there's a story where Shalana, if I'm pronouncing that right, punished Raven because Raven gave man fire.
Yes,
That sounds
Raven's a
like
trickster.
Prometheus. And
Yes, Raven does. Raven created the cosmos. Raven done anything.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And
and like
sometimes we don't know if they're just natural human thought, that humans just have these stories and apply to someone, or did
yeah,
it a story that travelled. And that's where we, as say, create mythings. We chop stories up into little components and see how many exist in other stories. And if we can see a story change and its mythings reduce as it goes somewhere else, we can still have confidence it's travelled a path.
yeah. There's a story. This is where things get even more interesting. I would say there's an Aztec story where a god, well, actually a couple of gods, they tear apart a goddess and they make everything from her.
Okay.
Kind of like, kind of like, kind of like what you see in Babylon with Marduk and Tiamat. I'll see if I can find that story real quick. Just give me 1 second.
Yes. So a chap called Michael Witzel, who's head of Vedic studies at Harvard, he's written a book on old mythologies and recognised that the sacrifice of a giant has been one of our oldest creation myths all over the world. We suggest that is,
Hmm.
an original story, from probably just after 55,000 years ago, although that sort of time period. So because everybody outside of Africa is descended from a group that left Africa 55,000 years
I've
ago.
I found it.
Okay.
Uh,
So it suggests that group probably had a set of stories that were so
mhm.
integrated that they were spread over the world.
It's the Tlauticutal. Um, I think the gender actually is debated, but nevertheless, the similarities remain. Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca, they tear this deity apart and they make the world.
Hmm.
Hmm. They ripped Tlauticutl's body into two. Uh, from the upper half came the sky. The lower part came the earth.
Yep. That
Yep.
So, I would firmly believe that is a story we were telling each other tens of thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
And it's adapted and changed.
Yeah, and it is interesting these um parallels. They
Exactly.
really are.
But I'm also saying, or not saying, there was an advanced civilization years ago that we've lost, because I don't want to be, aligned to some other people. But I am saying that myths can persist, and myths persist
Right.
because they are sacred. So you feel they're important stories that have to be told. But often we find that those stories were told in a poetic form or a song form. So if you notice, some of our oldest writings are poems or songs. because if you can't write things down, the easiest way to remember something is via a song. You're far more likely to remember. I mean, you could probably remember a nursery rhyme from your childhood that you haven't sung since you were a child. If I asked you to think of one,
There are also some interesting linguistic parallels, even like when you look at the Inca religion, they have the goddess Pachamama,
mm-hmm.
and you hear this consistent thing, like the feminine, the feminine, like mama, and in the Sumerian, even mommy, so you see mommy, or mama, that the pronunciation is very similar. That got passed around.
Skeptical of those. I'd rather a linguistics expert, someone, a biologist.
Well, I'm not either. I'm bringing that up though because you can hear the parallel, and they're both associated with the feminine.
Yes.
Yeah, that's just why I quickly bring that up.
So we see, so there's something called ultra conserved words. So ultra conserved words that haven't changed in a long time, and things like mama are in there, and you, me, I, things that really common words. But there's actually a few words that aren't common that have still persisted, and they are bark, as in the tree bark, ash, as in what's left over after a fire, and worm, which is another name for snake or serpent. Those three words haven't changed in over 20,000 years, really. We can trace them back. So they are really important things. And so if you find myths with serpents, ash, and bark in there, you're probably onto a very old myth as well. So it's interesting.
Yep. Joshua Moody, thank you for your super chat. The dismemberment of Tiamat and the utilization of all her parts to craft the cosmos within the Inume Lish seems to be more at home with nomadic groups and how they utilized the entire animal.
Potentially, but let me tell you about the Indo-Europeans and the cow. So the Indo-Europeans who were pastoral farmers, the cow was the ultimate object, because you can use its hide for clothes, you can use its bones for tools, you can eat its flesh, you can use its urine for antiseptic, you could even use the food it creates for its babies, its milk, to drink. It was like 100% useful, and that's why it was considered a gift from the gods. And that they weren't necessarily nomadic. So I can understand what you're saying, that you make ultimate use of things, but I think that is just natural human behavior in a world where you have to work hard for things. You can't go down Walmart and buy something for your dinner or whatever. You don't waste anything in those days.
Yeah, and the implications of these parallels, because I think you alluded to this earlier, that some take it too far and they imagine a lost advanced civilization over stuff like this. I'm like, no, that's not what it means. It just means, religion's a lot older than some people think. And
religious thought, yes.
Yeah, and myths are being changed and borrowed a much longer span of time than people tend to realize.
Indeed. And there are many ideas on how religious thought came about.
Yeah.
So there's sort of two. There's one of believing in something else. And I think that came around even when we were primates, when death happened. Death is such an emotional experience, not to those who died, obviously, because you're dead, but to those your family who surround you, that
right.
What it stirs in you is a thought of why. And, even at the simplest terms, you see primates such as chimpanzees and even cattle, even other animals, even elephants. They have behaviours when particular members of their group die. There is something in there, and I think that is probably one of the things that made us think, actually, what happens when you die? Where do you go? Your body's still there. You haven't disappeared, but it's not moving. and there's some thought process there. And I think that's, the earliest ritual behaviour we really see is around burial. Mortuary behaviour, I guess you'd call it, mortuary rituals, where people are buried in the ground and then buried in the ground in a particular position, buried in the ground in a particular position with an item. When that starts happening, there is thoughts about something going on, what happens to that person after they're dead. That's sort of a kind of religious thought. But in terms of religion itself, that's slightly different in terms of believing in a god. And I was speaking to an excellent PhD guy who studies mythology, and he was talking about, his name is John Norman Mason, and he was talking about how, I think it was Goffman, I think it's a philosopher who was talking about how we frame things. So we live in a world that we see, and can understand. But when human brains could start thinking of an imaginary world and for things to happen in that world, like outside of the real world, and then can talk and share that with someone else, so someone else could see that world, and then other people could listen to that story and understand it. That is when we started to develop actually religion, because we could have this idea of something else and other people could understand it. But when that happened, I don't know. But I'd imagine we must have been capable of doing that for over 100,000 years, but whether we were actually applying it to a religion, I don't know. That seems more recent, probably in the last 70 to 50,000 years, 55,000 years.
Let's see. We'll take this one. DBK says, John, I know these Skirian gods battle with the chthonic serpent of the underground water was made into a story of cattle. Was it adopted from cattle to the water cycle by farmers?
Okay, so the dragon stories are such that in the beginning, that the earliest stories are having the dragons were benevolent to the creation of the world. They were good. But then when we farmed agriculturally, they became malevolent. They were holding the water back. But then pastoral farming came after agricultural farming, so probably after those stories. So we see that the stealing of the cows by the enemy, which was often considered a dragon, came after the agricultural sort of water type battles. And they're really interesting stories. So you see it in the Bible with David and the Philistines. We see it in the middle of Africa. So we can actually show in the Psalms culture that we can show that Indo-Europeans travelled from the Pontic Caspian steppe down to Central Africa, or South Sub-Saharan. Anyway, there's DNA evidence showing that, and they have the stories there. Mm-hmm. So that myth's going on. But what's quite interesting, one of the stories I like to say is that when the myth travelled, because it was spoken at the time from Persia to India, I think cattle were called, and everything's poetry. You're not just telling a story, you're telling it as poetry, because that's what you did back then, because you couldn't write it down and you had to remember it. So you create metaphors and kennings and like so analogies for what's going on. So people, rather than, they couldn't find a word that said, the dragon stole the cattle. So they said things like the dragon stole the females that gave milk. And that's sort of that description went to the Rig Veda, and the word went from, I think it was the Danu to Danu, because it was similar. But in the Rig Veda, Danu means actually women, humans that give milk. So what you then find is that the story of dragons stealing cattle in the Indo-European sort of landscape turns into dragons stealing women, which eventually goes into Europe, and you get dragons stealing princesses. And that's why most of our stories we know recently about dragons are women locked up in towers. It should actually be cattle, but due to a slight, in effect, mistranslation, we lost that. So that's the evolution of the dragon myth.
Derek says, awesome guest, Jacob. Great to see you in the chat, Derek. Thank
Derek's
you.
a wise man. Hope you will, Derek.
I want to go back to we were discussing earlier is the motif, the myth of the cow suckling.
Oh yes,
it's so it's very interesting because not only do we see this in the Norse myth, the Greek myth, also the Hindu myth, and various other myths, cultures. And I'm trying to think of. So in the Greek myth, I'm trying to remember the name, and it's slipping. I'll find it. Let's kind of think here. Because in the Norse myth, obviously Ymir does that. No, not Ymir. Biri.
No, Ymir. Ymir is
Ymir.
sucking from the Thumbler, the cow. It's his body who kills. But it's Birdie who.
Yeah, I see why. Yeah, I see why I misremember because because the and correct me if I'm mispronouncing this. Aumbla.
A Thumbler or Umbler.
A Thumbler.
Yeah. I mean, there's depending you want to pronounce it.
I guess I was a little close.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Whatever way you pronounce it.
A Thumbler is the one that licks Biri out.
Yeah,
of the salty ice block. That's where I got confused.
Thumbler.
Yeah. I had the roles flipped in my mind.
Exactly, which is quite interesting. You have to think there's a creation myth, and in the beginning there's this primordial being and the cow. It's like, what?
Yeah.
Where does that come from? And then say we know.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, Dayu's wife, Priva, is also symbolized by a cow, and there's I think some argue that there's a link there potentially.
Oh, well, absolutely, yeah. The thing was twisted. So the Rig Veda is a bit. Let's say that thousands of years have gone on from the story getting there to it changing, and the horse becomes really important in India, and that takes over much of the world. So the cow becomes sacred, and the horse becomes the equivalent of the cow in terms of the sacrificial animal, because they can't sacrifice the cow. So you see the change in that, and cows are considered the essence of fertility. So what people maybe not realise is that until we did pastoral farming and dairying and could drink cow's milk, the average human would suckle a child for about 4 years. A child would be to about the age of 4 before they'd stop suckling on their mother. When we started dairying, that age dropped down to about 2. That means women could have twice as many children at that point because they could look after them and feed them. That is a huge advantage.
I remember what I was trying to figure out now. Amalthea, the Greek, the Greek goddess that is identified as the one that was suckling Zeus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to remember.
Yes, it isn't.
Yeah.
There is a thing there that the milk of the gods. So to speak, there is a significant importance in that.
And I think some have pointed out before, but that does sound a little like Alfombla.
Yes,
from the Norse. Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at.
Exactly. And in societies where cows are important in Greek society, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't quite as significant as the steppe or the Scandinavians, where everybody would own cows. In Greek, they didn't have. Not everybody owned cows, but they were important. There are cattle raiding myths with Geryon and Heracles. I think has to kill him to get the cattle. We see it all the time. In fact, in Scandinavia, you may not think there is a cattle raiding myth because there's nothing obvious, but actually the myth of Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent, it's quite a famous story, is a cattle raiding myth. reflex. So what you find is there's a story where Thor is disguised. He comes across Hymir, who's a giant who wants to kill Thor, but doesn't realise Thor's Thor because he's in disguise. Anyway, Thor stays there and at his home, and they decide to go fishing. And Hymir isn't keen on Thor fishing, but tells him to get his own bait. And Thor actually kills Hymir's best cattle to get bait, a cattle head from his best cow, and uses that as bait to catch the Midgard serpent, the serpent of the world, to try and then kill it. And that is the cattle raiding myth, but reflexed. It's turned on its head. So rather than the dragon stealing the cattle, the hero has killed the cattle to get the dragon. But that is so we have to be cognizant of these kind of twists in myths to understand that they're all still related.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember where else I was going with this because I had it and that just slipped my mind. Let's see. Well, I try to remember. I'll see if I can find another question to take from the chat. Oh, I remember now. Heracles. You brought up Heracles a minute ago, right?
It's killing
So,
cattle. Yep.
yeah, I think some have made comparisons between the 12 laborers of Heracles with the Slavonic Kresnik, because there was a claim that he had done similar labors or almost a similar amount of labors. And that's something.
Familiar with that. I'm not. I mean, it's possible. I mean, it sounds like a traditional kind of story to say, someone has to do a number of tasks to achieve something. That's a standard hero's journey kind of story. So that seems very plausible.
It just occurred to me that there's also, I remember something else I remembered. Because I haven't really given it this kind of level of thought in a long time, is you have the story of Volos stealing Purin's wife, Mokos. And and I know that many have compared that to Hades kidnapping Zeus's daughter, Persephone.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's an interesting similarity there.
The underworld sort
and
of myth.
Kind of see a similar story in Mesopotamia. Now, one of them's more speculative, a speculative reconstruction by Samuel Noah Kramer involving Curve, a dragon, kidnapping Ereshkigal. But many question if that's actually a real Mesopotamian myth. So a more legitimate comparison that's not necessarily reconstructed but is attested by the text is Nergal forcing Ereshkigal to marry him when he invades the underworld. He breaks in and he forces Ereshkigal to marry him. So it's not quite the same. It's weird because it's almost flipped in a sense where she's already in the underworld, but the male deity goes down there and forces the marriage instead.
But what happens is the force of the marriage happens in the underworld. So the assault on Persephone is because what Hades does is happens in the underworld. So it suggests there's evil happening there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's true. That's a good point. Yeah. Like what I meant to say is that Persephone, prior to that, could freely, I believe she could go freely on the surface, unless I'm misremembering some of those details.
For a number of months a year.
Right.
So 6 months.
And she trades places with Aphrodite because of the whole Adonis stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
He's creeping in. But as I said, there could be various versions of the myth.
Right.
I'm less familiar with the Greek classics because there are so many of them, and I need to
Yeah,
remember
that's
so
true.
many as it is.
They can quite get messy and get confusing very fast.
Exactly, different versions and Roman myths as well. But yeah,
and you also see that with a rivalry between Ereshkigal and Nana for Dumazy, I believe that happened at some point.
okay.
And it's
Really
kind
because
it's
that
kind of like what
that travels through Phoenician. I mean, I think many people forget how important Phoenicia was in connecting the Greeks with the Near East, and I think you'll find there's much going on there that twists the story before stories come either way. But I don't know enough about Phoenician mythology and what's documented there to find out. But that will be the place where you could probably uncover many links, many stories.
Oh, most definitely. Let's see. DBK says, John, do you feel like some meaningful common thread is still held between the most removed versions of the myth, say Thor versus Serpent Giant and Thunderbird versus Uktana?
Well, fundamentally, there are. I mean, you take it into good versus evil, I guess. So, yeah, at some point, there's that, but also you have to understand why was the myth told. So, many these kind of myths were tended to be told. The dragon myth was the dragon had to be slayed, the enemy had to be slayed for everything to be resolved. And why would you do that? Because you wanted to be a hero. You wanted to be remembered as a hero. And there's a really interesting phrase used in a Proto-Indo-European we've reconstructed. And I think it was Wald who writes about this in How to Kill a Dragon, his book, which is very interesting on recreating poetry, Indo-European poetry. And he comes across a phrase that is fame does not decay. So he's basically saying that if you are a hero and you do something heroic, which you would do if you're a hero, then people would sing songs about you and your name would never be forgotten. It would remain intact. And that's what it's trying to do. So there's two things here. There's one, good v evil, keep the enemy at bay. But there's two, that be a hero and we will forever remember you in history by singing songs about you. And to me personally, that last one is really, really interesting. As I say, I'm not religious, but there are some fascinating things I see in the myths I read, and the one of fame and not decaying, i.e., be the best person you can be, and you will be remembered. I really love that as a thought. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, there's good v evil will always be there, but be a hero, and people will remember you, however you become a hero. Yes.
What would you say fascinates you personally the most about the Proto-Indo-European religion? Which aspect of that do you think?
I am fascinated. Well, I am always grateful that we have been able to reconstruct it with a high confidence to see this cosmogony, a universe that is balanced, that we see how it fits together and why they would sacrifice and how the world was made and how people were made and how it all fits together. So we got this exceptionally good worldview, which to me, I mean, I'm a mathematician at heart. I love maths and things that make sense. And to me, it makes far more sense to have a world like that than maybe the Abrahamic world, which seems less balanced. It's be good, and that's it, or you go to hell after, sort of thing. So that seems really basic to me, but I like the world that there's a reason for things happening. Obviously, we've got science today, and you don't need those things, but it fascinates me that we can reconstruct their world to do that. It fascinates me that we can see how their religion changed for different cultures and why it changed is really fascinating. And to be able to say reconstruct things like fame does not decay, so they had a real belief there that you should be the best person you can be, is again fascinating. It is. I don't know. I love studying mythology. I study myths from around the world and trace them back, and it's always amazing when you can have confidence of you can find a myth that was probably being told 55,000 years ago when we left Africa, because it is worldwide, and we can see how it would have changed and travelled to be where it is. Stories using the stars, stories from floods, stories of creation. But for the Indo-Europeans, it is how we've really managed to reconstruct or construct, I would say, is probably more academically accurate, their cosmogony. And that fills me, I don't know how to describe it, with pride and happiness, because it allows me to do my job a lot easier.
So I think we can close there, because we could go on about all these parallels and the variants, and I believe we shall certainly do so the next time. Because this is fun stuff. I don't get to talk about this enough. I really don't. I mean, I sort of have with others I've had on the channel, like Professor Wendy Doniger.
Mm-hmm.
I really love her work on Hinduism, and she definitely does dive into parallels at the Proto-Indo-European stuff when it crosses over with her work. So I really recommend her books. And I just want to remind everybody real quick that John White's YouTube channel is called Craig and Ford, and the link to it's in the description below and the pinned comment. And also the link to the website. I want to remind everybody what that website is called again.
Mythology Database. The Mythology Database. Just search for Mythology Database, and it'll probably be the first thing in Google. So,
thank you. All right, John. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Been a pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.